Sarah Whitaker pressed her father's journal against her chest and walked straight into the feed store, where 6 men had just finished laughing at her name. She did not lower her eyes. She did not slow her step. She set the bank notice flat on the counter where everyone could read it: 90 days full balance or forfeit, and she said quietly, "Tell me where I can find 20 horses nobody wants." The room went silent. Then somebody laughed again. She was already walking out the door. If this story moves you, subscribe and follow it to the very end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1879 hit Red Willow, Wyoming, like a punishment. By the second week of June, the creek had already dropped 6 inches, and the dirt on Main Street was cracked so fine it turned to powder under wagon wheels. Men stood in the shade outside Carver's Feed and Seed and argued about rain that wasn't coming. Women fanned themselves in doorways and spoke in low voices about which ranches were already behind on their banknotes. Nobody talked about Whitaker Ranch out loud. They didn't have to. The silence around that name said everything. Sarah Whitaker was 36 years old, and she had been a widow for 8 months. Caleb Whitaker, her father, not a husband. Though most people forgot that detail had died the previous October, 2 days after the first frost, sitting in the chair by the east window, with his boots still on. The doctor said his heart simply stopped. Sarah believed it was more complicated than that. She believed her father's heart had been breaking quietly for years, ever since the West Field flooded, and never fully came back, ever since the drainage went wrong, and the best 100 acres of Whitaker land turned into a black, tangled bottomland mess that swallowed tools and broke axles and sent every hired hand home cursing. Caleb had watched that field die. Sarah had watched him watch it. Now she was the one watching. She stood at the edge of the West Field on the morning of June 14th, before the heat rose and made the air shimmer, and she looked at what everyone in Red Willow called the dead ground. The grass out there was coarse and yellow-green, the kind that only grew where water sat wrong under the surface. Old fence posts leaned at strange angles. A rusted four-cart frame lay half-buried near the north end, visible only because the weeds around it had died back some in the dry spring. You couldn't see the water from the surface, but Sarah could feel it, a heaviness in the air that didn't match the drought baking everything else. She had her father's journal in her coat pocket. She'd been carrying it everywhere since March. Thomas Reed found her there. She heard his horse before she heard him speak. A clean, well-shod animal on dry ground made a particular kind of sound, crisp and deliberate, the sound of money. Reed rode a gray gelding with a black mane always brushed. He was 42 years old, and he wore his suits even in summer, even in the field. And Sarah had decided long ago that this was not vanity. It was a message. The suit meant, I do not work with my hands. I do not sweat for anything. Things come to me. Mrs. Whitaker, he said, pulling up beside her. Mr. Reed. She didn't turn around. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the same field she was looking at. 90 days is a generous extension, he said. Most notes in default, we call them at 60. I understand that. The board considered your situation sympathetically, given your father's history with the bank, his long relationship with us. Sarah turned then. She looked up at him, one hand shading her eyes from the eastern light. How much of the south pasture would satisfy the note? Reed smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. The south pasture alone isn't sufficient collateral for what's owed. You'd need the south pasture, the barn, the water rights, and the east 40 to meet our minimum threshold. That's the whole ranch. Yes, he said. It is. He let that sit. Then he clicked his tongue and turned the gray horse back toward the road. 90 days, Mrs. Whitaker. I do hope you find a path forward. She watched him ride away. She waited until the sound of hooves faded. Then she opened her father's journal to the page she'd been reading for weeks, the one near the back, written in his careful small handwriting. Drain line from Big Rock to Creek Bend, North Branch shallow, junction blocked, Westfield not dead, only waiting. The water has to go somewhere. Give it a direction. She read it 3 times. Then she looked back at the 100 dead acres. She had an idea. It was the kind of idea that sounded wrong the moment you said it aloud. The kind of idea that would make a room full of men go quiet and then start laughing. She had learned growing up under Caleb Whitaker to be suspicious of ideas that felt too safe. The safe ideas were the ones that had already failed. The wrong-sounding idea that was usually the one nobody had tried yet. She needed horses, not 1 or 2, 20. Ned Carver was not a cruel man. Sarah had decided that years ago, and she still believed it even on days when she wanted to revise the opinion. He was small-minded in the specific way that comes from never having been wrong about anything important, never having lost anything he couldn't afford to lose. He'd run the feed store for 20 years. He knew every ranch family in the county, every debt, every bad season, every marriage that went sideways. He held that knowledge carefully, like a man who keeps all the good cards in his hand and waits. He was behind the counter when Sarah walked in at 7:30 in the morning. 2 other men were there, Arlen Briggs from the sawmill and a young cowhand Sarah didn't recognize buying grain. "Mrs. Whitaker." Ned set down his ledger. "What can I do for you?" "I need to know who's selling horses they can't use," Sarah said. "Draft stock work animals. I need 20 head." Ned stared at her. Arlen Briggs turned from the window. 20 head, Ned repeated. "Yes. Draft horses. Working horses. Sound legs doesn't matter what else is wrong with them. Temperament age doesn't matter. I need horses other people have given up on." Ned set both palms flat on the counter. "Sarah." He rarely used her first name. It was a sign of a kind of pity she hated more than rudeness. "You know what your note is with Reed's Bank. You know what your operating account looks like. I run your feed tab. I know what you've got." "Then you know I'm not asking for credit," she said. "I've got enough to buy the animals. What I need is the names." "For what?" Arlen asked from the window. He wasn't being rude. He was genuinely baffled. "What are you going to do with 20 horses on a ranch that size without hands to work them in the middle of a drought year?" "Put them on the west field," Sarah said. The silence was complete. Even the young cowhand went still. Then Ned Carver laughed. Not loud, not mean. Just the short exhale of a man who has heard something that doesn't make sense. "The west field," he said. "Yes." "The dead ground." "It's not dead. Sarah, 3 men tried to work that field before your father gave up on it. Nobody has tried what I'm going to try." She kept her voice level. "I'm not asking for opinions, Ned. I'm asking for names. Who has horses they can't move?" He looked at her for a long moment. The look said, "I feel sorry for you, and I don't know how to say it without making it worse." Then he sighed and pulled out a different ledger, the one he kept for accounts owed across the county. "Hector Mills over in Brush Creek," he said slowly. "He's got 7 or 8 horses he can't feed through summer. Flood took his hay barn in April." He turned a page. "Pete Alderman's widow has 4 she's been trying to sell since spring. Nobody wants them because they're old, but they're sound." Another page. "There's a man came through 2 weeks ago, left 6 horses at the livery because he couldn't pay the board. Joe Hatch has been trying to find a buyer." He looked up. "That's not 20. "It's enough to start," Sarah said. "What are they asking for the Mills horses?" Sarah. "What are they asking Ned?" he told her. She calculated quickly in her head, the way her father had taught her, run the numbers first, let the feeling come after. "Write a letter for me," she said. "To Mills, to the Alderman widow, and to Joe Hatch. Tell them I'll come in the next 3 days, and I'll pay fair price." "You're going through with this." "I am." He shook his head slowly, but he reached for paper and pen. Because whatever Ned Carver thought of a woman's judgment, he had been raised to respect a direct request and an honest offer, and Sarah Whitaker had always paid what she owed. Arlen Briggs watched her go. At the door, she heard him say quietly to no one in particular, 20 horses on the dead ground, Lord Almighty." She kept walking. Like, Elias Boone lived at the end of a dirt track east of town in a house that was more a collection of well-maintained tools than a dwelling. He was 68 years old, and his hands were so calloused from 50 years of ditch work that they didn't look like hands anymore. They looked like something shaped specifically for grabbing hold and not letting go. He had dug drainage trenches across half of southeastern Wyoming. He had worked on irrigation lines, canal grades, field tile systems, and creek diversions. He had worked for men who got rich from what his hands made possible, and he had never once asked for more than his day wage. Sarah had known him since she was a girl. He had worked for her father twice, once on the East Field system and once on the Barn Foundation. He was the kind of man her father had trusted completely, which was not a category with many members. She rode out to see him on the second day. He was in his yard when she arrived, sharpening a long-handled spade with a flat file. He looked up when she dismounted and didn't seem surprised, the way old men who have seen enough of life rarely seem surprised. Miss Sarah. He still called her that, the way he had when she was 12. You look like you've got something on your mind. I do. She tied her horse to the post and pulled out the journal. I need you to look at something. She showed him the page. He read it once, then read it again, then tilted the journal to catch the light better for a third reading. He didn't say anything for almost a full minute. Your father wrote this, he said finally, the year before it flooded. I think he knew the drainage was failing and he was trying to work out where. Elias looked at the words again. Junction blocked. North branch shallow. You know where Big Rock is. Southeast corner near the old property marker. And Creek Bend is where the water turns north. Yes, it's roughly 300 yards. He closed the journal carefully and handed it back. If there's tile laid between those 2 points, he said, and if the junction went, which is what his notes suggest, then yes. The water has nowhere to drain. It just sits in the subsoil and keeps everything above it wet and sour. Can it be fixed? He looked at her steadily. Yes. If the tile is still there, if it hasn't collapsed, if the grade is intact, yes. You'd need to find the junction open. It clear the blockage, reset the grade if it's sunk. Hard work, wet work. He paused. You can't do it with wagons. The ground is too soft. Even in the driest year, that field won't hold a loaded wagon until the tile is running. That's why I need horses, Sarah said. Animals with 4 legs and light feet. They can move where wheels can't. Elias was quiet. Then he said, You're going to put horses on the west field to find the drainage line. They can feel where the ground is firm. I watched my father's horse do it years ago. She'd pick the solid path even when you couldn't see it from above. I need animals that will work with the ground and show me where it holds. The old man set down his file. He put his hands on his knees and looked out past his fence at nothing in particular. There's a raised bed, he said almost to himself. Old farm roads in this country, they were crowned, built up in the center so water ran off to the sides. If there was a road through that field before the creek shifted, it might still be there, buried under years of grass and silt. If your horses find that, you'd have a work surface. That's what I'm hoping for. He looked at her then with an expression she couldn't quite name, something between respect and sorrow. The look of a man who has watched too many people fail at hard things and isn't sure yet which category this falls into. How much time do you have? He said. 90 days from 2 weeks ago. He counted silently. 76 days, he said. That's not much. No, Sarah said. It isn't. Will you help me? He picked up his file again, turned the spade over, ran the file once along the edge. Then he set it down for the second time. I'm not as fast as I used to be, he said. I know. My back goes wrong in wet conditions. I know. I'd need to be paid by the day, same rate as 30 years ago. Done. He nodded slowly. All right then, he said. Let's go look at your field. They walked the west field together that evening, while the sun dropped and the heat came off the ground in waves. Elias moved slowly, probing the earth with a long iron rod he'd brought from his shed, pushing it down at intervals, reading the resistance where it stopped on hardpan, where it sank into soft subsoil, where the water table was close enough that the rod came back wet. Sarah walked beside him and said nothing. She had learned from her father that there were men who talked when they were working, and men who went silent, and Elias Boone went silent, and the right response was to let him. After an hour, He stopped at a point roughly 40 yards into the field from the eastern fence. He pushed the rod down. It hit something solid at about 14 inches solid in a way that wasn't rock with a hollow quality he seemed to feel through his palms. He pushed again. Same result, 6 inches to the left. 6 inches to the right, solid ground soft. He moved 8 feet north. Same depth, same result. He stood up and rubbed his lower back. "There's a line here," he said. "Something firm at 14 inches running north to south. Tile or old timber, hard to say without digging. But it's not natural hardpan. The spacing is too regular." Sarah felt something move through her chest that she couldn't afford to feel yet. "That could be the drain line." "Could be," he said carefully. "Won't know until we open it." "Can we follow it?" "Tomorrow, first light before the heat." He looked at the sky, then back at the ground. "Your horses," he said. "When do you get them?" 3 days. He nodded. "Good. Get to the old ones first. The ones that have been in bad ground before they'll know how to move in it. Young stock gets nervous, does stupid things, get stuck." He pointed toward the northeast corner of the field. "There's a section over there I want the horses to walk before we do anything else. If that roadbed is there, they'll find it." Sarah looked at the northeast corner. It looked exactly the same as every other part of the field, flat, coarse-grassed, unremarkable. "My father always said the land remembers what it was," she said. Elias made a sound that might have been agreement, or might have been a man with a sore back being philosophical about pain. "Your father was usually right about things like that," he said. "Let's hope he still is." She brought the first horses home on a Tuesday, 7 of them from Hector Mills, who met her at the gate of his Brush Creek property, looking embarrassed. Not at selling, but at what he was selling. The horses were rough-coated from a wet spring and light from short rations, but their legs were clean and their eyes were clear. The oldest was a dark bay mare of about 14 years, calm as standing water, who loaded without hesitation and stood quietly in the trailer while the younger animals fretted. "That one's name is Stillwater," Mills said, nodding at the dark bay. "She's the one that leads the others, goes where you put her, and the rest follow." "She's the one I want," Sarah said. Mills looked at her. He had heard, as everyone in the county had heard, what she was planning. "You know, folks are saying you've lost your mind," he said. "Not unkindly, just honestly. I know. Westfield's been dead since before my time." "It's not dead," Sarah said. She paid him what they'd agreed, counted out the bills carefully, took his receipt. "It just needs the water to move." He watched her lead the dark bay mare toward the road. He didn't laugh. He was a man who'd lost a hay barn in a flood, who understood that land and water could do unexpected things. But he shook his head slowly, the way a man does when he's watching someone walk toward something he can't see the end of. She picked up the 4 alderman horses the next morning, and the 6 from the livery the afternoon after. By Thursday evening, 19 horses stood in her south pasture, and she was short one. The 20th came by accident. A man came through Red Willow Friday morning, leading a horse so thin its ribs showed through its coat, a gray with a damaged left front ankle that had healed crooked. He was trying to sell it for almost nothing, and nobody wanted it, and he'd left it tied to the post outside Carver's when he went inside to buy himself lunch. Sarah saw the horse from across the street. She walked over. She stood in front of it, and the horse lifted its head and looked at her. And something in the way it looked, steady, exhausted, patient, made her think of her father sitting by the east window in October. She untied the lead rope and waited for the owner to come out. "I'll take it," she said. He charged her almost nothing. He looked relieved. She walked the gray down Main Street toward the livery to get her trailer, and outside Carver's. Ned Carver stood on the step with Arlen Briggs and 2 other men Sarah knew from church, and they watched her pass with the horse, and she heard Ned say, not trying to be cruel, just helpless in the face of what he was seeing, 20 horses. Lord Almighty, she's done it." And then she heard Arlen say quieter, like a man commenting on weather, "Those horses won't save her. Nothing will." Sarah kept walking. Stillwater's lead was in her left hand, and the gray's was in her right, and the street was hot and bright, and she could feel every man's eyes on her back, and she did not slow down, and she did not turn around. She had 70 days left. The West Field was waiting, and somewhere under 100 acres of dead ground, her father's drainage line lay blocked and silent, holding the land hostage to water that had no direction, no outlet, no way out. She had 20 horses, one old ditchman, a journal, and a deadline. She walked home. The morning Sarah put the first horses on the West Field, 3 men rode out from town to watch. She didn't invite them. Nobody ever invited spectators to a failure. They just showed up on their own, drawn by the particular gravity of watching someone do something everyone agreed was wrong. Ned Carver was one of them. Arlen Briggs was another. The third was a man named Cecil Pruitt, who owned the dry goods store and had the specific habit of showing up wherever there was likely to be a story worth repeating later. They tied their horses at the east fence and stood in a row with their arms folded. Sarah didn't acknowledge them. She had Elias on one side and Stillwater on a long lead in her right hand, and she walked to the edge of the field and stopped. She let the dark bay mare stand for a moment. Let her breathe, the air feel the ground under her feet settle into the space. "Easy," Sarah said. Just that one word. Stillwater's ears moved forward. She dropped her nose and blew once hard through her nostrils. Not fear, just attention. She was reading something Sarah couldn't read. And then slowly, she took one step forward onto the wet, coarse grass. Elias watched without speaking. He had his iron rod in his right hand. Stillwater took another step, then another. She was moving at an angle not straight into the field, but drifting northeast, picking her path without being directed, her feet testing each step before she committed weight to it. "She's going northeast," Sarah said quietly. "Let her go," Elias said. They followed. Sarah kept the lead rope long and loose, not guiding, just attached. The mare moved with that particular deliberateness of an animal who understands the ground is not to be trusted in the simple way, who has learned to listen through her hooves. Behind them, Sarah heard Ned Carver say something to Arlen Briggs low enough that she couldn't make out the words, and then Arlen made a short sound that might have been a laugh. Stillwater stopped. She stopped so suddenly that Sarah almost stepped into her. The mare stood square, all 4 feet planted, her head lowered, and she began to paw the ground, not nervously, not in distress, but deliberately scraping back the coarse grass with one front hoof in a slow, measured stroke. Elias moved up on the left. He pushed his iron rod into the earth where Stillwater was pawing. It hit solid at 11 inches, then skipped slightly the hollow resonance of tile or timber at depth. He pushed 6 inches to the right, solid at the same depth. 6 inches left. Soft deeper, no resistance at 14 inches. He looked at Sarah. "She's standing on the crown," he said. Sarah's breath came out in one slow, controlled exhale. The roadbed. The old crown. Raised center, probably built up 8 inches above the field grade, at some point silt-covered now, but it's here. He moved the rod 12 feet further along the line Stillwater had been walking. Same result. 11 inches solid, slight hollow. He walked another 12 feet. Same. "It runs northeast to southwest," he said, "just like the trail on your father's sketch." "How far?" He looked out across the field. "Only one way to find that out." Stillwater turned her head and looked back at Sarah, the way a patient animal looks at the person holding the rope when it has done what it was supposed to do and is waiting for acknowledgement. Sarah put her hand flat on the mare's neck. "Good girl," she said. Behind them at the fence, the 3 men from town were very quiet. That was the first mini-climax of the morning, and it wasn't even 8 o'clock. The roadbed ran for 230 yards. They spent the rest of the morning mapping it, Elias with his rod and Sarah with stakes and twine. Stillwater walking the line each time Sarah needed confirmation of where the crown held firm beneath the grass. The other horses stayed in the south pasture, watching over the fence, the way horses watch things that interest them. Ears forward, bodies still processing. By noon, they had a route. Not a wide route, 6 feet of reliable surface at the crown, maybe 8, if they stayed careful, but enough to walk a horse through with a load enough to work from without sinking a wheel or losing an animal. Elias sat on the fence rail at the eastern edge and drank from his canteen and looked at what they'd marked. "If I'd known this roadbed was here," he said, "I might have told your father something different." "What do you mean?" 30 years ago, when I dug the East Field system, your father asked me about the West Field. I told him I didn't see a way in ground was too soft nothing to work from, but I was thinking about wagons. He paused. Didn't occur to me to think about horses. 4 legs, light feet, better sense of ground than any wheel ever had. Might have saved him 20 years of grief. Sarah didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. The grief was spent. What was left was the work. "How long to clear to the junction?" she asked. Elias calculated. "If the grade is intact, 2 weeks to probe the full line, maybe 3 to open the blockage once we find it. If the tile is collapsed, we're looking at relaying sections. That's a different story." Assume best case. Best case, 4 weeks to running water. 4 weeks left them roughly 6 to plant and grow enough to satisfy Thomas Reed. Sarah did the arithmetic and didn't share the result with Elias, because the result was that it was exactly tight enough to be possible and exactly wrong enough to be terrifying, and she needed him thinking about the drainage, not the deadline. "All right," she said. "We start tomorrow." She walked back toward the south pasture to check on the rest of the horses. As she passed the east fence, Ned Carver was the only one still there. Arlen and Cecil had apparently gotten bored of waiting for failure and ridden back to town. Ned sat on his horse with his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim. "That old roadbed," he said. "I didn't know that was there." "Neither did I," Sarah said. "My father did." He looked at the line of stakes running northeast across the field. Something was working behind his eyes. Not an apology. Ned Carver wasn't built for apologies, but something adjacent to one. The recognition of a man who has been confidently wrong and is just beginning to understand it. "You still can't plow it in time," he said. "Even if you fix the drainage." "I'm not planning to plow it," she said. "Then how?" "Late corn," she said. "You can push late corn into broken ground if the soil is right and the moisture is right. I'm not trying to run a full crop. I need enough yield to cover the banknote. 100 acres of the right bottomland, properly drained, properly planted even late, that's enough." Ned looked at her with that expression again, the one that was somewhere between pity and something he didn't have words for. "And if it doesn't drain right, if the tile's collapsed, or the grade's off, or the junction can't be found?" Sarah looked at him directly. "Then I lose the ranch, and you have something to talk about for the next 20 years, she said. "But I'll tell you one thing, Ned. I'm not going to stand at the edge of my father's land and not try." She walked away. She heard him say behind her, very quietly, almost to himself, "No, I don't reckon you are." She didn't look back. The next 3 weeks were the hardest weeks of Sarah Whitaker's life, and she had lived through her mother's death, her father's decline, and an October funeral in frozen ground, so the category had strong competition. They worked the field every morning from first light until the heat became dangerous, not just uncomfortable, but genuinely threatening, the kind of July heat in Wyoming that kills livestock and drops men without warning. Elias set the schedule, and Sarah didn't argue with it up at 4:30. Horses fed and rigged by 5:15 on the field, by 5:30 off the field, by 10. Afternoons were for repair work, harness mending equipment, and the accounts that still had to be managed, even when everything else was falling apart. She put different horses on the field each day, rotating them, learning which ones could handle the soft ground and which ones got anxious. The oldest animals were the best. Pete Alderman's widow had sold her 4 horses as near useless, but they turned out to be the most valuable animals. Sarah had a set of matched bays in their late teens, so experienced in hard terrain that they moved through the soft sections of the field with the patience of men who have done a difficult job. So many times they've stopped being scared of it. The gray horse with the crooked ankle, the one she'd bought for almost nothing off the post outside Carver's, turned out to be the one that gave her the most trouble and the most information. He didn't want to move in the wet sections. He would stop, plant his feet, and refuse, and at first Sarah thought he was simply stubborn or frightened. But Elias watched him for 2 days and said, "He's not stopping at random. Watch where he stops." And she watched, and the gray was stopping consistently in the same 3 areas sections where the ground felt firm from above, but where Elias's rod found no resistance below 12 inches, the places where the surface would hold for a moment and then give way. The gray had learned somewhere in whatever bad history had bent his ankle not to trust ground that felt safe but wasn't. "He's smarter than the rest of them," Sarah said. "He's been hurt more than the rest of them," Elias said. "It's not the same thing." They found the drainage line extending all the way to Big Rock on the 17th day. It was intact tile, not timber old clay sections laid in the 1850s by whoever had first tried to farm this bottomland, still holding their grade, still connected all the way until the junction. The junction was a mess. Where the north branch met the main line near Creek Bend, a section of clay tile about 4 feet long had collapsed inward, folded under the weight of years of wet soil pressure. And behind that collapsed section, 3 decades of silt and debris had packed itself into a solid plug. The water from the north branch couldn't move. The water from the main line couldn't move. Everything above it just sat, swelling the subsoil, poisoning the root zone, turning 100 acres of good bottomland into the dead ground everyone called it. Elias stood at the edge of the excavation they'd done to expose the junction and looked at the collapsed tile for a long time. "Well," he said, "can we fix it?" "We can fix it." He crouched, peered at the break. 3, maybe 4 days to pull the collapsed sections clear, the plug lay new tile. "I know a man in Cheyenne who makes the right size. I'd need to send a wire today." "Send it. The tile will take 4 days to arrive by freight." Sarah calculated. That was a week they didn't have set against a timeline that was already a week too short. "What about while we wait?" she said. Elias looked at her. "While we wait for the tile, we clear the plug. All of it. Manually." He looked at the packed silt. "It's going to be ugly work. Wet. Confined. Smells like 30 years of stagnant water." "I know. You'll need to be in there yourself. I can't fit through the access point anymore, my shoulders." Sarah looked at the excavation. She looked at Elias. "Show me what to do," she said. He looked at her for a moment, the look of a man taking the measure of something he has just newly understood. "All right," he said. "I'll show you." That was the 2nd week. The 3rd week was worse. The tile arrived on a Thursday. That morning, 2 things happened that changed the shape of everything. The first was that Thomas Reed rode out to the West Field for the 2nd time. He came alone this time, which was notable. Reed usually traveled with at least one other man, his clerk or a bank associate, someone to witness and corroborate. Alone on his gray gelding, he rode along the east fence line and stopped at the point where Elias and Sarah had their tools laid out, and the excavation was open and the work was visible. Sarah was in the excavation. She was on her knees in wet clay, scooping silt by hand into a canvas bucket, her arms black to the elbow, her hair plastered flat under her bonnet. She heard the horse, and she looked up, and there was Thomas Reed looking down at her, and whatever expression he'd come out here wearing rearranged itself when he actually saw what he was looking at. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said. "Mr. Reed." She kept working, scooping and dumping, scooping and dumping. "I heard you were attempting something with the West Field." He looked at the excavation, the staked line running northeast, the horses standing in harness at the edge of the cleared path. "What exactly is it that you're attempting?" "Drainage repair," she said. "My father's notes identified a blocked junction on the main tile line. We've exposed the break. New tile arrives today." Reed was quiet. She could feel him looking at the work, the real work. Not the idea of it, the actual muddy physical evidence of weeks of labor, and she could feel him trying to fit it into the category where he'd already put her. "You're trying to drain the West Field," he said. "And then plant it." "Yes." "In July." "Late corn, yes." He was quiet again. When he spoke, his voice had a different quality. Not the smooth confidence of the bank, not the performative pity, something more careful. "If the drainage works, he said slowly. "And if the ground responds the way you're expecting, what's your projected yield?" Sarah sat back on her heels and looked up at him. "Enough to cover the note," she said, "with something left over for winter feed." He looked at her for a long time. "I'll need proof of viable planting before I can consider adjusting the timeline," he said finally. "I'm not asking you to adjust anything," Sarah said. "I'm telling you I'll meet the terms." Something moved across his face, not respect exactly, but the first cousin of it. The acknowledgement, reluctant and precise, of a man who has judged a situation and is beginning to wonder if he judged it too quickly. He touched the brim of his hat. "Good day, Mrs. Whitaker," he said. He rode away, and Elias, who had been standing very still and very quiet at the edge of the excavation throughout this exchange, looked down at Sarah and said, "He's worried." "Good," Sarah said. She went back to scooping silt. The second thing that happened that Thursday was that Ned Carver came out to the field. Not to watch. He came with his wagon, and in the wagon were two young men from town. His nephew, and someone Sarah didn't know, and 3 fence posts and a roll of wire and a covered basket from which, when he set it on the tailgate, the smell of fresh biscuits emerged. Sarah stopped working and looked at him. Ned stood by his wagon with his hat in his hands, turning it the way he always did when he was uncomfortable. "I thought," he said, "maybe your fence line on the north section could use some work. Cecil Pruitt's cattle have been pushing against it, and 2 posts are loose." Sarah looked at the basket. She looked at the fence. She looked at Ned. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know I don't." He didn't look away. "My nephew needs work to do, and I need somewhere to put him. And my wife made biscuits." He paused. "She made a lot of biscuits." Sarah looked at him for another moment, this small-minded man who had laughed in his feed store and spread the town's doubt and shown up to watch her fail. And she saw that he was uncomfortable and sincere, and that these were not mutually exclusive things, and that people were more than the worst version of themselves, even when that version was the one you'd seen most recently. "Thank you, Ned," she said. "Don't thank me," he said quickly. "It's just fence posts." But his nephew and the other young man worked that fence line all morning, and Ned stayed and handed tools. And at midday, when Sarah and Elias stopped for water, there were biscuits, and the 4 of them ate in the shade of the wagon, without talking very much, which was its own kind of conversation. The new tile went in on Friday and Saturday. This was the work that Elias was made for: laying grade checking level, setting the clay sections in the correct sequence, ensuring the junction connected cleanly to both branches of the system. Sarah was beside him the whole time, learning as fast as she could, because she understood that she might need to know this for the rest of her life. She asked questions, and he answered them, and she remembered everything. Sunday they backfilled the excavation and replaced the topsoil as cleanly as they could. Monday morning at 5:45, Elias pushed his iron rod into the earth 8 feet above the junction, and they waited. Water moved through the subsoil, silently invisible the way important things often move. But the rod, when Elias pulled it back, came out dry. He looked at it. He looked at Sarah. "It's draining," he said. Sarah pressed her hands flat against her thighs to keep them from shaking. She pressed her boot into the earth, and it was still soft. Of course, it was still soft. 3 decades of standing water didn't resolve in a week, but there was something different in the texture of it, something less absolute, less dead. A quality of potential that hadn't been there before. "How long until the field is workable?" she said. Her voice was completely steady. She was proud of that. "Another 2 weeks before you can put a horse on it with any real load. 3 before I'd trust a cedar." He looked at the sky. It was clear and hot and dry, the drought holding hard over everything. The dry weather helps. Every day without rain, the field drops faster. 23 days to plant," Sarah said. She was not asking. Elias looked at her. 23 days to plant, he confirmed. She looked at the field, 100 acres of dark bottomland, wet and coarse and unpromising to any eye that didn't understand what was happening underneath. Her father's field, his life's uncompleted project, the thing that had broken his heart one slow season at a time. "All right," she said. She went back to work. The town found out about the drainage that same week. She didn't know who told whom, probably Ned or his nephew, or the young man she didn't know who turned out to be Arlen Briggs's son and had apparently talked about nothing else at his father's dinner table. Red Willow was not a large place, and it had no mechanism for keeping things quiet. The reaction was what she expected: skepticism with a thin edge of curiosity. She heard it secondhand through Ned, who reported it with the particular honesty of a man doing penance without using that word. "People are saying it can't drain fast enough," he told her one morning when she stopped at the feed store for salt blocks. "They're saying even if you get the water moving, the ground's too sour for a late plant." "What are you saying?" Sarah asked. He looked at her directly. "I'm saying I don't know," he said, "and I've decided that's an improvement." She bought her salt blocks and left. That was the most useful thing Ned Carver had said to her since this started, and she meant it. The last week of July arrived. The field was drying. She could feel it changing day by day in a way that was almost physical, almost like watching a person recover from an illness. The color of the grass, changing the surface, texture, firming the specific heaviness of trapped water, giving way to something drier and more alive. Elias measured it with his rod every morning and reported the drainage depth, and every morning the number was better. She put Stillwater on the field on the 28th of July, not with a load, just to walk it, just to let the mare go where her feet told her and see what she found. It was the same thing she'd done on the first morning, the same long loose lead, the same patient following. But this time the ground under Stillwater's feet was different. She walked further than before. She walked the whole northeast section, the crown of the roadbed, and she didn't hesitate, didn't test each step with the careful reluctance of an animal navigating something uncertain. She walked like she was walking on ground she trusted. Elias stood at the south end and watched her go and didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "It's ready." Sarah felt something she hadn't let herself feel in 3 months of full breath, the kind that starts at the bottom and fills completely. She stood with the lead rope in her hand and Stillwater at the end of it, moving across ground that had been dead for 30 years. And she thought about her father sitting in his chair in October. And she thought about the pages of his journal. And she thought about what it meant to finish something for someone who couldn't. She didn't let herself cry. There wasn't time for that yet. "Get the cedar," she said. Elias almost smiled. He was not a man who smiled easily, but the corners of his eyes did something. "Already cleaned and oiled it yesterday," he said. "Thought we might be needing it." Sarah looked at him. "You were sure?" "No," he said. "But I was hoping. And with drainage work, hope and preparation are about the same thing." She began to laugh, not the short, painful kind, but a real laugh, sudden and surprised, the first real laugh in longer than she could remember. It startled Stillwater, who tossed her head and then settled, because Stillwater settled at everything. 23 days to plant. She had 20 horses, 1 old man, 1 gray horse with a crooked ankle who knew how to read bad ground, and a field that was waking up from 30 years of silence. And somewhere in Red Willow, Thomas Reed was sitting in his bank and counting days, and Ned Carver was telling his wife about what he'd seen, and the town was arguing about what was possible and what wasn't, and none of that mattered right now. The ground was ready. Sarah Whitaker picked up her cedar and walked into the west field, and the horses followed her, because that is what horses do when they trust the person leading them. They follow. The cedar was a single-row, hand-pushed implement her father had built himself, iron-frame wooden handles, worn smooth by 30 years of his palms. Sarah had oiled it 3 times in the past week, not because it needed 3 oilings, but because doing something useful with her hands kept her from doing the math she couldn't stop doing in her head. 23 days. Late corn needed 85 days minimum to make a harvestable ear. She was not planting for a full harvest. She knew that. Elias knew that. What she was planting for was enough ears on enough stalks on enough acres to walk into Thomas Reed's bank and set a number on his desk that he could not argue with. A partial yield from 100 acres of the richest bottomland in Laramie County, properly drained, properly worked, would still be more corn per acre than anything growing in the drought-blasted fields surrounding Red Willow. She had done the arithmetic 18 times, and it came out the same each time. It was possible. It was close and tight and dependent on weather she couldn't control and soil she couldn't fully predict, but it was possible. She planted the first row on the 29th of July. Elias walked beside her, and Stillwater and one of the old alderman bays pulled a second implement they'd rigged from parts in the barn, a rougher tool slower, but it meant 2 rows at once instead of 1. The seed went into the ground dark and warm, and the soil closed over it like it was receiving something it had been waiting for. She planted from 5:30 in the morning until the heat drove her off the field. Then she went back at 4 in the afternoon and planted until dark. She slept 5 hours and got up and did it again. On the 3rd day of planting, Ned Carver's nephew showed up at the field gate at 5:15 in the morning with a horse and a 3rd seeder his uncle had sourced from somewhere, and a note that said simply, "He says he wants to help. I said that was all right." Ned. Sarah read the note twice. She looked at the nephew whose name was Daniel, who was 19 years old and clearly uncomfortable, but standing his ground. "You know how to manage a horse in soft ground," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "You know you don't push through when the animal hesitates." "Yes, ma'am." "You follow the marked rows, and you don't cut corners because the surface looks firm." "Yes, ma'am." She handed him a bag of seed corn. "Then get started," she said. Daniel Carver planted beside her for 6 days straight without being asked to come back. He didn't talk much, which she respected. He worked hard, which she respected more. On the 4th day, he brought his friend Arlen Briggs's son, the one who'd fixed the fence, and then there were 4 of them, Sarah and Elias, and 2 young men who'd grown up hearing the West Field called cursed planting seed into ground that 30 years of adults had told them was worthless. She didn't let herself think about what that meant yet. There was no time. The planting finished on the 19th day. 4 days ahead of the deadline she'd set herself, which should have felt like a victory, and felt instead like the moment at the top of a very long climb, when you look down and realize how far you still have to fall. The seeds were in the ground. Now the ground had to answer. She went into the house that evening and sat at the kitchen table with her father's journal open in front of her, and she did not read it. She just sat with it, the way you sit with someone you've been missing for a long time, not needing conversation, just needing the presence. After a while, she said out loud to the empty kitchen, "I did what you said, Papa. I gave the water a direction." The kitchen didn't answer, but in the morning when she walked the field at first light before the heat rose, she found the leading edge of the first row had broken soil overnight. A tiny pale green curve of stem, no bigger than a thumbnail, pushing up through the dark bottomland earth, like it had somewhere important to be. She stood over it for a long time. Then she went back to work. The first 10 days of August were the hardest waiting she had ever done. The corn came up. It came up slowly, then faster, the way things grow when the soil is right. Not the desperate, spindly growth of plants fighting bad ground, but the solid, thick-stemmed emergence of plants that have found everything they need exactly where they're standing. By the 8th of August, the rows were visible across the whole field, green lines against dark earth, and by the 12th, they were knee-high and climbing. Around Red Willow, the drought was tightening. The other ranches and farms were watching their summer corn stall in the heat stalks, yellowing at the edges, ears not filling. The creek was the lowest it had been since 1871. There was talk of families leaving. There was talk of the bank calling notes early of a hard winter following a hard summer of a county that had seen better decades. Sarah's Westfield looked like a different world. The bottomland soil, 30 years of organic material accumulating in the wet, now draining properly, held moisture at the root zone, in a way the upland fields simply couldn't. Even in the drought, even without rain, the corn in the Westfield had access to what it needed. It grew like it was making up for lost time. She tried not to watch it too obviously. It felt dangerous to pay too much attention to a thing that could still fail. But other people were watching. Ned Carver came out to the field fence on the 14th of August and stood for a long time without saying anything. Sarah saw him from the far end of the field and kept working. She was checking the drainage outfall at Creek Bend, to make sure nothing had shifted in the summer rain they'd had the week before, and when she came back toward the gate, he was still there. "That's the tallest corn in the county," he said. "I know. By a significant amount. I know Ned." He turned his hat by the brim. "Reed came into the store yesterday," he said. "Bought a bag of oats. Didn't say much, but he stood at my window for a while." He paused, looking this direction. Sarah felt something cold and sharp move through her despite the August heat. "How far out is his deadline?" 18 days, she said. She knew the number without calculating. "You think you'll have harvestable ears by then?" She looked at the field. The corn was tall, thick, dark green in a way that made the drought-hit fields around it look gray by comparison. But harvestable ears were another question. "Some of them," she said carefully. "Enough to show yield. Enough to put a number on paper." Ned was quiet. Then he said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" "What?" "I keep thinking about what you said in my store, back in June, when you asked for those names." He looked at her. "I laughed. Not out loud, but I laughed. I thought you'd lost your mind." "I know. I should have—" "Ned." She stopped him, not unkindly, but firmly. "You gave me the names. That's what I needed. The rest of it doesn't matter now." He looked at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize as his particular form of respect, uncomfortable and genuine, and not quite able to find the right words to carry itself. "If there's anything else I can do," he said. "There is actually," Sarah said. "I need 3 men with wagons on the 1st of September, for the harvest. I'll pay fair wages." Ned nodded immediately. "Done," he said. "I'll have them here." She watched him leave and thought about the way people moved in and out of their better and worse selves, pulled by what they feared and what they wanted others to think of them, and then sometimes in the right moment pulled toward something simpler and truer. She had been angry at Ned Carver for months, and she found standing at her fence in the August heat, watching his wagon move back toward town, that the anger had gone somewhere else and left behind something more complicated and more useful. She filed it away and went back to the field. The first disaster came on the 17th of August. She was checking the north section in the early morning when she found it a section of the field, roughly 20 feet across, where the corn had stopped growing. Not dying, not yellowing, just stopped. Frozen at about 2/3 of the height of the surrounding stalks, sitting still, while everything around it continued to climb. She stood in the middle of the stopped section and felt her chest tighten. She called for Elias, who was working the drainage outfall at the south end. He came walking fast for a man with a bad back, and he stopped beside her and looked at the section without speaking for a long moment. "What's wrong with it?" Sarah said. He crouched and pressed his hand into the soil. Then he took out his iron rod. He still carried it every day out of habit or professional instinct and pushed it into the earth at the edge of the stopped section. It sank to 14 inches before it stopped. Firm. Normal. He moved to the center of the stopped section. It sank to 11 inches, and then not hard resistance, but soft resistance, the specific soft resistance of saturated subsoil with nowhere to drain. "Tile," he said. "There's a lateral section that's not draining. The main line is running, but there's a branch somewhere under the section that's still blocked." He pulled the rod back. It came back damp. This 20 feet the water is still trapped. Sarah felt the arithmetic shift in her head. 20 feet of corn not reaching full ear set. 20 feet wasn't a catastrophe in a 100-acre field, but it was a signal. If there was one blocked lateral, they hadn't found there might be others. And if the blocked laterals were spread across the field, rather than clustered, the yield projections she'd been calculating were wrong. "How do we find them?" she said. "Fast." Elias looked at her. He looked at the stopped corn. He looked at the horses standing at the field edge. "The gray," he said. She understood immediately. The gray horse with the crooked ankle, the one that stopped at bad ground, that planted his feet, and refused where the surface was firm, but the subsoil wasn't. She'd been rotating him off field work because he was the slowest and most difficult. She hadn't understood that his difficulty was data. "I'll get him," she said, She brought the gray out and walked him slowly through the corn row by row. It was awkward work. The corn was tall enough now that they were moving through it rather than over it, the leaves brushing her shoulders, the ears forming above her head. The gray moved steadily, and then in the third row from the west stopped. Sarah marked the spot with a stake. They spent 3 hours walking the gray through the field, marking every place he stopped. 11 spots total. Some clustered, some spread. When she mapped them on the rough diagram she'd been keeping in the journal, the pattern was clear blocked lateral branches. Most of them in the northwest section of the field, the section furthest from the main line, the section where water had been sitting the longest and the tile was oldest. 11 sections, some small, some as large as 30 feet across. Maybe 4 or 5 acres total scattered through the field. 4 or 5 acres of corn that would not make full ear. She did the new arithmetic. She sat on the fence rail with the journal and the pencil and the numbers, and Elias stood beside her and waited because Elias always knew when to wait. The numbers were worse. Not impossible, but worse. The yield from the remaining healthy sections was still enough to cover the banknote if the prices held, if the drought-thinned supply from surrounding farms drove prices up the way she expected. But there was no room left in the margin for anything else to go wrong. "We need those laterals running," she said. "All 11. "I know." "How long?" "If we work every day," he calculated. 5 days, maybe 6. She had 11 days until Reed's deadline. "Do it," she said. "What do you need?" "Daniel and his friend," he said. "And someone to manage the horses while we're in the excavations." Sarah looked at the 11 stakes scattered through the cornfield. 5 days of digging in the middle of a standing crop, working around corn stalks in August heat, with a back that went wrong in wet conditions. She looked at Elias. "Your back," she said. "We'll hold," he said, firmly, not inviting discussion. "Elias, we'll hold," he said again. "I didn't come out here in June to stop at the hard part." She held his gaze for a moment. This old man with his calloused hands and his honest heart, who had lived his whole working life, making things drain right and watching other men get rich from it. And she felt something in her chest that had no business being felt in the middle of a crisis. "Thank you," she said. Just that. "Don't thank me," he said, which was apparently what the men of Red Willow said when they meant you're welcome. "Get Daniel." They found the second disaster on the 4th day of excavating the lateral blockages. Daniel and Elias were in the 3rd excavation northwest corner, clearing a packed silt blockage that had looked similar to all the others. Sarah was at the surface managing the horses, sending down tools, and pulling up buckets of silt, when she heard Elias's voice come up from the excavation with a quality in it she hadn't heard before. "Sarah," he said. "Come down here." She climbed down into the excavation. It was narrow, barely enough for 2 people, the walls dark clay, the bottom wet. Elias was crouched at the tile level with his work lantern held close to the wall. He moved it so she could see what he was seeing. The tile at this junction wasn't blocked with silt. It was collapsed. The same way the main junction had been collapsed, the clay sections folded inward under years of ground pressure. But this section was longer. Much longer. She could see the break running east into the wall of the excavation, which meant the collapse extended beyond what they'd opened. "How far does it go?" she said. "Don't know," he said. "Could be 6 feet, could be 15. He looked at her steadily. "If it's 15 feet, we can't lay new tile in time. Not the right size I used the last of the Cheyenne order on the main junction." Sarah felt the bottom drop out of something. She sat with that feeling for exactly 3 seconds, the way she'd learned to sit with bad information, let it land, absorb the weight, and then move. And then she said, "What are our options?" Elias thought. He didn't rush it, which she appreciated even now. "I can send a wire to Cheyenne today. If they ship same-day freight gets here in 4 days. That leaves us 7 days to lay and backfill. That's enough time if nothing else goes wrong." "Yes." "What's the other option?" He was quiet for a moment. "There's a second supplier, out of Denver, faster freight line." He paused. "More expensive." "How much more expensive?" he told her. She sat with that number. It was the difference between meeting the banknote with room to spare and meeting it exactly with nothing left for winter feed or operating costs. It meant a second winter of absolute margin, no buffer, no safety. She thought about the gray horse with the crooked ankle. She thought about trust and ground that felt safe, but wasn't. "Denver," she said. "Send the wire to Denver." She climbed out of the excavation and walked to the fence and called for Daniel's friend. His name was James. She'd finally learned that, on the fourth day, James Briggs Arlen's youngest, and sent him to town with the wire and the money for the freight deposit. He rode hard the way young men ride when they've been given something important, and she watched him go, and then turned back to the excavation. Ned Carver showed up that same afternoon, which she hadn't expected. He came in his wagon, which she hadn't expected either. In the wagon bed was a load of split timber and a stack of clay tile sections, different size from what she needed, but something, and two men she recognized as regular customers from his store. "What's this?" Sarah said. Ned climbed down from the wagon with the careful movements of a man whose knees had opinions about things. "Heard you had a collapsed section in the northwest," he said. "Figured you might could use extra hands and whatever materials I had that were close." "That tile's not the right size." "I know." He looked at the excavation. "But timber shoring is timber shoring. While you wait for the right tile, you can shore the walls and keep the collapse from spreading." He looked at her. "Unless you already thought of that." She hadn't. She looked at the timber. She looked at Ned. "How did you know about the collapse?" she said. "You were in town this morning." Ned had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "James Briggs came through for the wire," he said. "He talks." Sarah felt something between exasperation and gratitude, and settled on something closer to the second. "All right," she said. "Bring the timber." The next 4 days were the most compressed, most physically brutal days she had experienced since her father died. They worked before dawn and after dusk by lamplight when the heat allowed it. Elias managed the tile work with the patience of a man who has done this for 50 years and knows that rushing drainage work costs you more time than it saves. Daniel and James moved earth like men who had found somewhere in the emergency of the situation a sense of purpose that surprised even themselves. Ned Carver's 2 men shored and fetched and held and hauled without complaint. And Sarah was everywhere in the excavations on the surface, managing the horses, carrying tools, doing the arithmetic in her head every hour, adjusting the plan as each new thing revealed itself, making decisions before she had all the information, because waiting for all the information meant making no decisions at all. On the evening of the 5th day, Elias climbed out of the last excavation, the 11th lateral, and straightened up as much as his back would let him, and said, "The last section is running." Sarah stopped. She was carrying a bucket. She set it down. "All of them," she said. "All 11. He pressed his hand to his lower back. "Every lateral on the line is clear. The main junction is running. The whole system is draining." She looked at the cornfield. The corn in the northwest section, the stunted sections, the ones that had stalled. She would need to walk the rows tomorrow in the first light to know how they'd responded if the sudden proper drainage had come in time to push the ears to fill, if the stalks would make up the lost growth in the remaining 6 days before Reed's deadline. She walked the rows that night by lamplight, with Elias beside her. The northwest section corn was shorter than the rest. That hadn't changed, but the stalks were stiffening, firming up in the way plants firm up when they stop fighting their environment and start using their energy for growth instead. The silk at the top of the ears was still fresh, not dried. There was time. Not much, but time. "Will they fill?" she said. Elias put his hand on a stalk, felt the stem, looked at the ear formation. "Some of them," he said. "Not all, but some." He calculated, or she thought he was calculating. He had the look of a man adding numbers he'd carried in his head for weeks. "I think you have enough," he said. "I think if the weather holds and nothing else goes wrong, you have enough." She nodded. She turned off the lamp because they needed to save the oil. They walked back through the dark field in silence. their feet finding the firm ground of the roadbed without needing to see it, because they knew where it was. By now they had walked it so many times it lived in their feet. At the field gate, Elias stopped. "Sarah," he said. She turned. "Your father would have—" He stopped. Started again. He tried for 20 years to figure out what was wrong with this field. He had the knowledge. He had the notes. He just didn't— Another pause. "He needed what you brought, the horses, the willingness to try it sideways instead of straight." He looked at her steadily. He would have been very proud. Sarah stood with that. She stood with it the way you stand with a thing that is too large for the moment that you'll need to come back to later, when there is space. "Thank you, Elias," she said. Her voice was steady. She was still proud of that. She went inside and sat at the kitchen table with the journal and the lamp, and she did the final arithmetic one more time. Full yield sections. Partial yield sections. Price per bushel at drought year rates. Transportation cost. Reed's note amount, the Denver tile bill. She added it twice and got the same number both times. She set the pencil down. It was enough. Barely exactly with nothing left over, but enough. 6 days until the deadline. 6 days for the corn to do what corn does when the ground is right and the water is right, and someone has done everything within human power to give it what it needs. She closed the journal. She put her hands flat on the table. Outside, the west field was dark and growing acre by acre, row by row, ear by ear. 30 years of waiting compressed into one August night, one woman's hands, 20 horses, and an old man who knew how water moved through earth. She blew out the lamp. She went to sleep. She woke before the alarm on the 1st of September with the specific alertness of someone who has not truly slept. The harvest was today. She lay still for 30 seconds, not resting, just organizing. The order of things. Who was coming when what needed to happen first? Ned had said 3 men with wagons. Daniel and James would be there. Elias had said he'd be at the gate by 5, which meant he'd probably been awake since 3. The horses needed feeding before anything else. The cedar needed to come out of the barn, and the wagon beds needed lining, so the ears didn't bruise on the way to the granary. She was dressed and out the door in 4 minutes. The horses heard her coming and moved to the fence the way horses move toward someone they associate with food and work, and consistent handling, not frantic, not desperate, just present. Attentive. Stillwater was at the front of the group, as she always was, her dark bay coat still dim in the pre-dawn, her ears forward. "Morning," Sarah said to her. She poured the grain. She had done this every morning for 2.5 months now. She knew each of these animals, their preferences, their habits, which ones needed more time to settle before being harnessed, which ones worked better beside which others, which ones communicated distress early, and which ones hid it until it became a problem. She had not expected, when she bought 20 horses nobody wanted in June, to come to know them this specifically. But that was what daily work did. It built knowledge whether you were trying to acquire it or not. Elias arrived at 5 o'clock exactly as promised, with Daniel and James behind him, and Ned Carver came at 5:15 with 2 wagons instead of 1 and 4 men instead of 3. Sarah looked at the extra wagon. "I said 3 men," she said. "I know what you said," Ned told her. He climbed down. "I brought 4. The extra one works for free because he owes me money, and this is how he's paying it back." He didn't look apologetic. He looked like a man who had made a decision and wasn't going to explain it further. Sarah looked at the 4 men. They were all known to her, all men she'd seen in Carver's store at church around town. All men who had heard at some point in the last 2 months, whatever the current version of the story was that Red Willow was telling about her and the West Field. "All right," she said. "Elias will show you the rows. Start from the north end and work south. Don't take any ear that isn't fully set. I'd rather have fewer good ears than more bad ones." She looked at each of them in turn. "And be careful with the corn. The stalks are tall and the rows are close. Don't push through, go around." They went to work. The harvest moved faster than she'd planned, which in her experience meant that something was about to go wrong somewhere else. She stayed at the south end of the field where the yield was densest, and she kept count in her head wagon load by wagon load, acre by acre, a running calculation of bushels that she was measuring against the number she needed. By mid-morning she knew. The northwest section, the stunted section, the blocked laterals, the section she'd been most worried about had responded better than she'd hoped. The corn was shorter than the rest, the ears smaller, but the ears had filled. The 6 extra days had been enough. Not full yield, not what the healthy sections were producing, but real corn, measurable corn with market value. She stopped in the middle of the northwest section and looked at a stalk she'd watched stop growing on the 17th of August. The ear on it was not impressive, smaller than her fist, lighter than what the south sections were producing. But it was there. It had done what it could with what it had been given late and partial and imperfect, and it had done it anyway. She picked it and turned it in her hands and thought that she was probably reading too much into an ear of corn, and then thought that her father would have read exactly the same things into it, and that was all right. Mrs. Whitaker. It was James Briggs coming down the row toward her. He had the specific look of a young man carrying information he wasn't sure how to deliver. "There's a man at the east fence, came on horseback. He's been standing there a while." She knew before she turned. Thomas Reed was at the east fence on his gray gelding, watching the harvest with an expression she couldn't read from a distance. He was not supposed to be here today. The deadline was the 3rd of September, 2 days away. He had no business being here today. She walked to the fence. She kept her pace even. He watched her come without speaking. When she reached the fence, he looked at her hands, which were corn silk stained, and dirty at her clothes, which were field clothes, and showed the morning's work. And then he looked past her at the wagons being loaded. "I came to assess," he said. "The deadline is the 3rd, she said. "I'm aware of when the deadline is." He kept looking at the wagons. "I wanted to see the field condition before we meet on the 3rd, to understand what I'm assessing." Sarah watched him. Something was different about him today. Not the suit, which was the same, not the gray horse, which was the same. Something in the quality of his stillness, the controlled stillness of a man working to maintain a position he can feel shifting under him. "What do you see?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I see a corn crop on the west field," he said, "which I would not have believed possible in June." "But you believe it now?" "I believe what I can see." He finally looked at her directly. "What is your projected yield?" She told him the number. She watched his face, and she saw the arithmetic happening behind his eyes, the same arithmetic she'd been running for weeks, yield times price times the note amount. All of it calculating to the same answer she'd arrived at 3 days ago at her kitchen table. He looked at the wagons again. "That assumes drought pricing holds," he said. "It will hold," Sarah said. "You know as well as I do that the surrounding farms are down 30 to 40% from normal year yield. There are families in this county who will need to buy grain this winter to feed their livestock. The price will hold." Another silence. The kind of silence that is not empty, but full of a man adjusting his understanding of a situation he thought he had already understood. "If you make full delivery of the note on the 3rd, he said, "the bank will of course clear the lien on the property." "I know what the terms are, Mr. Reed." He looked at her for one more moment. Then he reached up and touched the brim of his hat, the first genuinely respectful gesture she had ever seen him make. "Good day, Mrs. Whitaker," he said. He turned the gray horse and rode back toward Red Willow. Sarah stood at the fence for a moment after he left. She was aware of Ned Carver watching from 20 yards away, pretending not to. She was aware of Daniel and James having slowed their work to see what was happening. She was aware of Elias at the far end of the field, too far away to have heard, but watching her posture the way he always read information from the way people held themselves. She turned back to the field. "Keep working," she said to no one specifically, and everyone got back to it. The first wagon left for the granary at 10:30. Ned drove it himself, which she hadn't expected. She'd thought he'd send one of his men. Instead, he climbed up on the bench and took the reins and said, "I want to make sure it gets there right," which was his way of saying he wanted to be part of this in some specific way he hadn't found the right words for, Sarah let him go. She sent James with him to help with the unloading. The second wagon went at 1 in the afternoon, the third at 3. By the time the sun was dropping toward the horizon, the north half of the west field had been harvested, and the granary in town was fuller than it had been at the end of any season in recent memory, according to the granary operator who told Ned, who told Sarah later that evening when he brought the wagon back. He said he hasn't seen numbers like that from this county in 15 years, Ned reported. The bottomland, Sarah said. She was sitting on the porch steps, her boots off her feet aching from 12 hours on her feet. It's been building up organic matter for 30 years while everyone called it worthless. 30 years of worthless is a lot of corn, Ned said. Yes, she said. It is. He stood by his wagon for a moment, not leaving, but not saying anything, either, the way he got when something was working on him that he hadn't finished working out yet. Then he said, "My father used to say that land was patient, that it would wait as long as it needed to wait for the right person." Sarah looked at him. In 2.5 months, she had revised her understanding of Ned Carver several times, and each revision had made him smaller in one way and larger in another until she'd arrived at the truth of him, a limited man with an honest core, which was more than could be said for several people she'd known who started from the opposite configuration. "Your father was right," she said. Ned nodded, got up on his wagon, drove away. The second day of harvest was harder than the first because the south section corn. The healthy section, the fullest yield, needed 2 people to each row, and the ears were heavy, and the men were already tired from yesterday. But there was a quality to the tiredness that was different from the exhausting tiredness of not knowing if something would work. This was the tiredness of work completing itself, of effort arriving at its destination. The men moved slower, but steadier, and nobody complained, and the wagons kept coming and going between the field and the granary in a rhythm that felt by afternoon almost like something that had always been happening here. Elias worked until 2 o'clock and then sat down on the fence rail without being asked, because his back had made a decision for him that he hadn't been willing to make for himself. Sarah brought him water and sat beside him for 10 minutes, not to rest. She wasn't resting, but because he had earned 10 minutes of her company, and she wanted him to have it. "It's going to be enough," he said. He wasn't asking. "It's going to be enough," she confirmed. He drank his water. "You know," he said, "I've fixed a lot of drainage in my life, dug a lot of tile lines, made a lot of fields drain right that didn't before." He paused. This is the first time it felt like something more than fixing drainage. Sarah looked at the field. What did it feel like? He thought about it. Like correcting something that should never have been wrong, he said. Like setting right what somebody started and couldn't finish. She felt her throat tighten. She allowed it for exactly 3 seconds, then swallowed it back down. There was still work to do. "My father started it," she said. "You helped me finish it." "You finished it," Elias said. "I helped with the heavy parts." She left him on the fence rail and went back to the field. The twist came on the morning of the 3rd. She was up before 4, dressed at the table with the final numbers written out on clean paper. The complete accounting yield price delivery records from the granary, the exact figure she was bringing to Thomas Reed's bank. Everything in order. Everything documented. She had been over it so many times she could recite it without looking. She was reaching for her coat when she heard hooves on the road. Fast hooves, the specific rhythm of someone riding with urgency. She opened the door. It was Daniel Carver, and he looked wrong. His face had the white around the edges quality of someone who has just received news they don't know how to deliver. "Daniel," she said. "There's been a problem at the granary," he said. She felt the floor of her stomach drop away. "What kind of problem?" "Water," he said. "The roof, there's a section of the granary roof that's been weak since spring. Last night's wind came through hard, and it opened up. Some of the grain got wet." He stopped. He was looking at her the way people look at someone when they're about to deliver the worst part. "Uncle Ned's there now. He said to get you." She was on her horse in 4 minutes. She rode into Red Willow at a pace she didn't usually ride in town, and didn't care. The granary operator met her at the door. His name was Walt Heater, and he was 60 years old and had been running the Red Willow Granary for 23 years, and he looked right now like he would rather be anywhere else. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "I am sorry. I should have had that roof section repaired in June, and I didn't." "Show me," she said. He showed her. The damage was in the northwest corner of the granary. Of course it was the northwest corner, she thought, with a kind of black internal humor. It was always the northwest on this particular job, where a section of roof had separated and let in enough wind and moisture to damage roughly 15% of the stored corn. Not destroyed, but damaged enough that the moisture content would discount the selling price significantly. She stood in the northwest corner of Walt Heater's granary and looked at wet corn, and thought about how the universe had a particular sense of humor about northwest corners. Ned was behind her. She heard him breathing. "What's the adjusted number?" she said. Walt did the calculation with her, their pencil on paper working out the discount. She watched his pencil. The number when he finished was $12 short of what she needed to cover the full banknote. $12. She had crossed 3 states of possibility in 3 months, impossible, possible, certain, and was standing $12 short of the finish line on the morning she was supposed to walk into Thomas Reed's office and put the money on his desk. The silence in the granary was the kind of silence that has texture. Then Ned Carver said, "I've got $12. Sarah turned and looked at him. He had his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim. His expression was not charitable or pitying. It was the expression of a man doing arithmetic of a different kind, the kind that counts up what he owes against what he can pay. "The names," he said. "When you came into my store in June, I gave you the names and I laughed about it afterward, and I told Arlen Briggs, and I told Cecil Pruitt, and I made sure the whole town knew what I thought." He stopped turning the hat. $12, he said again. "I've got it right here." Sarah looked at him for a long moment. The man who had laughed. The man who had shown up with fence posts and biscuits. The man who had driven the first wagon himself and brought 4 men instead of 3. The man standing in a wet granary at 6 in the morning with $12 and his hat in his hands. "That's a loan," she said. "Not a gift. I'll pay you back before winter." "I know you will," he said. He said it like there was never any question. She took the $12. She rode to the bank. Thomas Reed was already at his desk when she arrived, which told her he'd been expecting her early, or perhaps he'd been there since before 8, working through his own version of the arithmetic that had been running in both their heads for 90 days. His clerk stepped aside when she came in, and she walked directly to Reed's office door and knocked once, and opened it without waiting. He looked up. His expression was composed. Professionally composed the way a man who has done this job for 20 years learns to compose his face when money is about to move in a direction he didn't originally plan for. She put the accounting on his desk. The full documentation, granary records, delivery receipts, adjusted, yield figures with the moisture discount noted, and explained price per bushel at current drought market rates and the total. She put the money beside the accounting. All of it. Then she put Ned Carver's $12 on top. Reed looked at the money. He looked at the accounting. He read it. Actually read it, which took 5 minutes, and she stood and waited while he read, because she wanted him to read every number and understand what each one represented. When he finished, he looked up at her. "This is the full amount," he said. "It is. Plus additional." "The additional is for next quarter's interest paid in advance," she said. "So there's no question about where we stand going forward." He looked at her. Something was happening in his expression. Not admiration. Thomas Reed was not built for admiration in the simple sense, but a recalibration. The specific recalibration of a man who has had an opponent and is discovering that the category was wrong. "The west field," he said. "The drainage system, is it permanent?" "Yes," she said. "The main junction is reset and running. The laterals are clear. Properly maintained, that system will run for decades. The field is viable then, long term." "It's the best bottomland in Laramie County," she said. "It always was." Reed picked up the accounting and looked at it again, and she understood that he was not reviewing the numbers, he had the numbers. He was a banker. He was looking at the thing the numbers represented. He was looking at what she had done. He set it down. He pulled a standard bank receipt form from his drawer and filled it out in his careful banker's hand and signed it and stamped it and passed it across the desk. "The lien is cleared," he said. "Whitaker Ranch is debt-free as of this morning." Sarah took the receipt. She looked at it. The ink was still wet. She let it dry for a moment before she folded it. "One more thing," Reed said. She looked up. "The Alderman property," he said, "north of your east fence. It came to the bank in May. The widow couldn't sustain it after her husband died. We've been holding it." He paused. "Given the demonstrated productivity of bottomland in this area, the bank would be interested in discussing a development note, if you were interested in expanding your operation." Sarah stood very still. This was the same man who had stood over her excavation in July and measured her failure. This was the same man who had ridden past her fence in June expecting to foreclose. And he was now from behind his polished desk in his summer suit, suggesting that she might want to borrow more money to expand. She kept her face even. "I'll think about it," she said. She walked out of this bank into the August bright September morning and stood on the boardwalk for a moment, the receipt in her hand, the street around her already getting its morning business started, wagons and horses, and the sound of Carver's feed store door opening across the way. Ned saw her come out of the bank. He was sitting on the bench outside his store, which was not where he usually sat at 8 in the morning, which meant he had been waiting. He lifted his chin in the specific question that doesn't need words. She held up the receipt. Ned looked at it from across the street. He nodded once. Then he went inside. Sarah stood there a moment longer. She was aware that Cecil Pruitt was watching from his dry goods store. She was aware of 2 women she knew from church, who had stopped on the opposite boardwalk. She was aware that whatever the next version of the story Red Willow told about her would be, it was being decided in the small, visible details of this moment, her posture, her expression, where she went next. She folded the receipt and put it in her coat pocket next to her father's journal. She untied her horse from the post. She put her foot in the stirrup and swung up and sat straight, the way her father had taught her to sit. Not proud, not performing, just upright, just present. She rode home. The west field was still standing. She could see it from the road, the south section not yet harvested, the last of the rows, waiting the remaining corn, tall and green and real. The thing that everyone had said was impossible, standing in the sun in the drought-burned landscape of Red Willow, Wyoming in September of 1879. She pulled her horse up at the field gate and sat there for a moment looking at it. 20 horses stood in the south pasture to her left. Still water at the front dark bay, and steady ears forward, watching Sarah the way she always watched Sarah, attentive, patient, waiting to see what came next. The gray horse with the crooked ankle stood at the back of the group. He wasn't watching her. He was grazing with the particular contentment of an animal who has found unexpectedly, and after a long time, a place where the ground could be trusted. Sarah watched him for a long moment. Then she opened the gate and rode in, and the horses parted to let her through, and she rode to the edge of the west field, and stopped, and she sat there with the September sun warm on her back, and the corn standing in the good dark earth her father had always believed was there. And she let herself feel for the first time in 3 months what it felt like when the thing you were trying to do had been done. It felt like breathing. The full kind, from the bottom up. She reached into her coat pocket and took out the journal. She took out the pencil. She opened to the last written page, her father's handwriting, ending mid-thought the way all lives end mid-thought. And she found the first blank line below his words. And she wrote, "Westfield opened. Water corrected. Horses settled. Land paid." She closed the journal. The corn moved in the light morning wind. Stillwater made a sound behind her, not impatience, just presence. "I know," Sarah said. "There's still work to do." She put the journal back in her pocket and turned her horse toward the unfinished harvest and went back to it the way she always did. The last rows of the west field came in on the 5th of September. Sarah didn't make a ceremony of it. There was no moment where she stopped and announced that the harvest was complete. No speech, no particular pause to mark the ending. One row finished, and she moved to the next. And then there was no next row, and that was how it ended. The way most real things end. Not with a signal, but with an absence, the work simply not being there anymore when you reached for it. She stood at the south end of the field, with an empty harvest basket and the September sun halfway down the sky, and she looked back at 100 acres of cut cornstalk standing in dark earth, and she thought, "It's done." Elias was at the north end. He walked toward her slowly, his back making its opinions known in the way he moved, and when he reached her, he looked at the field, the same way she was looking at it. Not like a man surveying completed work, but like a man looking at something he hadn't been entirely sure he'd live to see. "Final counts at the granary," he said. "Walt Heater tallied it this morning." "I know what the count is," Sarah said. "I know you know." He paused. "I wanted to say it anyway. It's a good number." "It's a very good number." He nodded. He looked at the field one more time. Then he looked at her with that expression she had learned over 3 months to read correctly. Not sentiment. Elias Boone was not a sentimental man, but something close to it, something that lived just on the other side of practical and didn't often get acknowledged. "Your father dug the original tile on this field," he said. "Did you know that?" She turned. "What?" "Not him alone. He was young, 20, maybe 22. He hired out to the man who owned this land before your grandfather bought it, spent 2 summers laying that main line." Elias looked at the ground. "I worked alongside him on the 2nd summer. That's how I knew him before I knew him as Caleb Whitaker the rancher. I knew him first as the young man who understood how water moved through earth." Sarah stood very still. "You never told me that," she said. "You never asked." He looked up at her. And it didn't seem like the right thing to say until the work was done, until it was worth saying. She thought about her father at 22 in this field laying tile. She thought about him at 60, sitting by the east window, watching the same field go wrong. She thought about what it meant to spend 40 years watching something you built fail slowly, and whether he had ever known in the last years, in the last pages of the journal, in the notes he left, that she was only now completing, whether he had suspected that someone else would come behind him and finish it. She thought he probably had. She thought that was exactly what he had intended when he wrote those 3 lines. Drain line from Big Rock to Creek Bend, North Branch shallow, junction blocked. He hadn't been recording a failure. He had been leaving instructions. She pressed her hand flat against her coat pocket against the journal. "Thank you, Elias," she said, "for telling me." He nodded once. "I'm going home to sleep for about 3 days," he said. "Send Daniel if you need anything." She watched him walk to his horse, slow and deliberate, a man who had earned every one of his 68 years and was carrying them all simultaneously. He mounted with effort and rode down the fence line toward the east gate, and didn't look back, because Elias Boone was not a man who looked back at things he'd finished. Sarah stood alone in the cut field for a long time after he left. Then she went inside and started planning the next year. The winter of 1879 came early and hard, the way Wyoming winters do when they've been storing up energy through a dry summer. By mid-October, the ground was frozen, and the creek was running at half its normal flow, and the families in Laramie County who hadn't put up enough hay in the drought summer were beginning to understand what the coming months were going to cost them. Sarah had hay. She had corn. She had grain. She'd stored against exactly this kind of winter, calculated out of the surplus from the West Field yield after the bank note was cleared and Ned's $12 were repaid, and the Denver tile bill was settled, and Elias's wages were paid in full plus extra, which he'd tried to refuse, and she hadn't let him. The extra she'd insisted on paying him, he'd looked at the amount and said, "This is too much." And she'd said, "No, it isn't." And he'd taken it without further argument, which was the right decision. She sold grain to 3 families in late October, at prices that were fair when the market rate would have supported unfair. She didn't announce this. She didn't make it a public act of generosity. She just named a price, and the families paid it and went home with enough to get through. Ned Carver found out because Ned Carver always found out, and he came to the ranch on a cold Tuesday and stood in the yard and said, You're selling below market. I'm selling at what I need, Sarah said, which is different from what the market will bear. You could make considerably more. I know. He looked at her for a moment with the look she recognized the ongoing revision of his understanding of her, still happening, still not quite complete. Your father did the same thing, he said finally. In the hard winter of '63. Half the county survived it partly because of what he charged for hay. Sarah hadn't known that. She filed it away next to what Elias had told her in the cut field. All these pieces of her father she was still finding months after his death from the people who had known him in the parts of his life that came before her. You going to tell me I'm making a mistake? She said. No, Ned said. He turned his hat by the brim. I was going to ask if you need help with deliveries. She looked at him. You have a wagon. I have 2 wagons, he said. She had the grain delivered by the end of the week. The thing that happened in November was the thing she hadn't anticipated, which was that Red Willow began to change its story. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Towns don't admit they were wrong the way people sometimes can all at once in a clear moment of reckoning. Towns do it sideways gradually, the way water finds a new channel. One conversation at a time, one revised account of events, one small shift in the way a name is said. She first noticed it at church, where Mrs. Alderman, the widow who had sold her 4 horses in June, stopped her after the service and said quietly, "Those horses of mine. Are they well?" "Very well," Sarah said. "The bays are the best working animals I have." Mrs. Alderman nodded a small, satisfied nod. "My husband always said they were misunderstood," she said. "People didn't give them time enough." "He was right," Sarah said. That was how it started. Conversations like that in small spaces, people bringing their pieces of the story back and seeing how they fit into the new version. Cecil Pruitt stopped her outside his store one afternoon and mentioned carefully that he'd been telling people about the drainage work, about the tile system, about what she'd done with the laterals. He said it in a way that made it clear he was presenting himself as someone who had followed the story with interest, rather than someone who had stood at his window watching for failure. She let him have that version. It cost her nothing. Arlen Briggs was the one who surprised her. He came to the ranch on a cold December morning, his son James behind him, and he asked to see the field. Not the granary records, not the bank receipt, the field itself. The cut field, the dormant field, the 100 acres of dark earth waiting under the winter sky. She walked him out there. He stood at the edge of it and looked at the cut stalks and the dark-turned soil and the tile outfall visible at Creek Bend, where the water was still running clean through the drainage line, even in December, even in the hard ground. "I told people it was impossible," he said. "In June, when you came through with those horses." "I know. I was wrong." She looked at him. Arlen Briggs was not the kind of man who said that sentence easily. The words cost him something, and he was paying it on purpose, and she could see that. "You weren't wrong about what you knew then," she said. "You were wrong about what was possible. Those are different." He thought about that. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe that's a generous way to put it." "It's an accurate way to put it." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the field. "My south pasture has a section that doesn't drain right," he said. "Been that way for years. I always thought it was just low ground." She looked at him. "How big a section?" 20 acres, maybe 25. "Do you know if there's tile already laid?" "I don't know. My father bought that land in '58. Never talked about tile." Sarah looked at the drainage outfall at Creek Bend. She thought about Elias Boone and his iron rod and the specific sound of resistance when the rod hit clay tile at 14 inches. She thought about 25 acres that might not be low ground at all, might just be waiting. "I know someone who can find out," she said. Arlen looked at her. Something shifted in his face, the specific shift of a man who has come to say something and is now receiving something larger than he came for. "I'd pay him fair wages," he said. "I know you would," Sarah said. "I'll speak to Elias." They walked back to the ranch in the December cold, without talking much, but the silence was a different quality from the silence of June, not the silence of judgment, but the silence of two people who have arrived by separate routes at a similar place. The twist that changed everything came in January, and it came from Thomas Reed. She was in the barn on a January morning checking on Stillwater, who had developed a mild cough in the cold that Sarah was monitoring carefully when Daniel Carver rode up fast and said Reed's clerk had left a message at Carver's store, asking her to come to the bank at her earliest convenience. She felt the old cold thing move through her, the one that had lived in her chest since June, since the first time he'd told her the deadline. She was debt-free. She had the receipt. He had nothing to call. But the cold thing moved anyway because it had become a habit, and habits don't dissolve with a single bank receipt. She went to the bank. Reed's office was warm. He had a fire going, which she noticed because in June he hadn't offered her a seat, and now he stood when she came in and gestured to the chair across from his desk. She sat. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Your message said convenient," she said. "This morning was convenient." He sat. He folded his hands on his desk in the way he had, the composed, deliberate way. "I'll come directly to the point," he said. "Please." "The Alderman property," he said. "The note I mentioned in September. The bank is prepared to offer terms that are different from what we typically extend." He paused. "Favorable terms. Extended maturity, below standard interest. The kind of terms we offer customers whose track record justifies them." Sarah looked at him. "Why?" she said. "Just that." He looked back at her, and then Thomas Reed did something she had not seen him do in all their months of dealing. He told her the direct truth without the banker's coding on it. "Because 3 families in this county are getting through a hard winter on grain from your west field," he said. "Because Arlen Briggs is talking about his south pasture, and 2 other men have asked Elias Boone about their drainage, and if what I think is going to happen happens, there will be productive farmland in this county that hasn't been productive in decades." He paused. "The bank's interests and your interests have turned out to be more aligned than I initially assessed." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "And in June," she said, "when you gave me 90 days. He met her eyes. "In June I believed you were going to fail," he said. "I was wrong. And I am telling you directly that I was wrong, which is not something I say often, and when I say it, I mean it." She sat with that. The acknowledgement she had not expected from the man she had least expected it from, delivered without performance or justification. Just the plain statement of a man who had run his arithmetic and come out at a different number. "I'll need to read the terms before I decide," she said. "Of course. And I'll want Elias Boone to look at the Alderman property before I commit to any development plan. I don't buy land I haven't walked with someone who understands the ground. That seems prudent. And if I take the note," she said, "I'll need to expand my horse operation. The Alderman acreage will need working animals. Good ones." Reed looked at her steadily. "I assumed as much," he said. He reached into his desk and pulled out a document. "The terms," he said. "Take as long as you need." She read them. They were good. Genuinely good. Not a trap. Not a performance of generosity with hidden costs. She read them twice, and the numbers were the same both times. She looked up. "I'll give you my answer in a week," she said. "That's more than fair," he said. She stood to leave. At the door she stopped. She turned back. "Mr. Reed," she said. "The families you mentioned. The 3 families getting through winter on grain from the west field." He nodded. "Were you aware of their situations in September, when you extended my original deadline?" He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for one more moment, understanding something she hadn't understood before about the man that he was. Not only what his suit and his composed expression suggested, that somewhere behind the banker's arithmetic, there was a different calculation running. One that included 3 families, and a hard winter one that had shaped a 90-day deadline instead of 60. "I see," she said. She didn't say thank you. She didn't think he'd want it said. "Good day, Mr. Reed." She walked out into the January cold. She told Elias about the Alderman property the next day, and about Reed's offer. Elias listened without interrupting, which was his way of listening when the information was serious. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. 20 additional acres of bottomland, he said. Properly drained. If it can be drained. In this county, he said, most of what people call bad land is just land that hasn't been read right. He looked at her. I'll walk it. I know you will. She paused. Your back. My back has opinions, he said. I've stopped listening to all of them. She smiled. It was a real smile, the way they'd been coming easier since September. Not less frequent, just less surprising to herself. I'll need more horses, she said. If the alderman land is what I think it is, I'll need more working animals. 20 won't be enough. Elias looked at her with something that might from a distance have been called amusement. You going back to Ned Carver for names, he said. Probably, she said. He always knows who has horses they can't use. He does, Elias agreed. The man knows everything that happens in this county that nobody wants to talk about. She laughed, a real one, short and genuine. She took the alderman note in February. Elias walked the property in March, when the ground softened enough for his iron rod, and found tile at 16 inches running most of the length of the low section, older than the Whitaker system, rougher work, but intact. 2 days of digging confirmed the junction was blocked, same cause, same solution. Different field, same problem, same answer. The second drainage project took 3 weeks instead of 3 months because she knew what she was doing now. She and Elias and Daniel and James worked the alderman laterals in early April before the planting season, and by the 15th of April, the low section of the alderman land was draining and the soil was firming, and Sarah was walking the rows planning what to put in the ground. She bought 6 more horses in March. 3 from a rancher up near Cheyenne who was reducing his operation, 2 from a widow in the next county. 1 from a man who'd come through town and couldn't afford the freight to take it further. She didn't look for perfect animals. She looked for what she'd looked for in June. Sound legs, clear eyes, horses that other people had stopped seeing value in. Stillwater moved through the new herd the way she'd moved through the original 20, not aggressively, not loudly, but with the quiet authority of an animal who knows its place in the world and doesn't need to argue for it. The new horses settled around her within a week. She showed them where the water was, where the ground was firm, where to stand in the wind. Sarah watched her do this one morning from the fence and thought about leadership, what it looked like when it was real, when it came from something earned, rather than something performed when it didn't need to announce itself. She thought her father would have liked Stillwater. She thought they would have understood each other. In May, Arlen Briggs started his own drainage project on the South Pasture, with Elias consulting and Daniel doing the physical work, and 2 of Arlen's own hired men learning the tile system as they went. 2 weeks in, a third rancher came to Sarah and asked if Elias would walk his east field when he had time. Elias, when she told him, said, "I'm not as fast as I was." "Nobody's asking you to be fast," she said. "They're asking you to be right." He considered that. "I'll need good wages," he said. "They'll pay them," she said. "And if they don't, I'll pay them myself and collect from them later." He looked at her steadily. "You're going to make this county drain whether it wants to or not," he said. "The county wants to," she said. "It just didn't know it was possible." He made the sound that meant agreement without quite being agreement. Then he picked up his iron rod and went to look at the east field. The summer of 1880 was different from the summer of 1879 in the way that matters most people were less afraid. Not because the drought was over, it wasn't. Not entirely, the creek was still low and the sky was still stingy with rain, but because there was food in the ground in places where there hadn't been before, and when there is food in the ground in the hard season, the fear changes quality. It doesn't go away, but it becomes manageable, survivable. Sarah's west field went in full that second year, the alderman acreage beside it. Together in the drought summer of 1880, they produced enough grain to supply not just Whitaker Ranch, but 4 other families in the county, and enough surplus to ship to the Cheyenne market at prices that made Thomas Reed's banker eyes do something Sarah had not seen them do before, widen slightly with the involuntary acknowledgement of a man watching numbers exceed his projections. She didn't mention it. She let the numbers speak. The day that Red Willow finally openly collectively changed its story came at the end of August 1880 at the county harvest gathering that Ned Carver had been organizing for 15 years, and that Sarah had never attended because there had never been a reason to go somewhere and stand among people who had decided what she was. Ned came to the ranch 3 days before and said, "I'd like you to come." "To the harvest gathering," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. "Ned." "I know," he said. "I know what it's been like. I know what people said." He stood with his hat in his hands in her yard, and the August sun was hot on both of them, and he was not comfortable, and he was not leaving. "But things have changed. And I think it matters that you're there, for other people to see it." "What other people?" He looked down at his hat for a moment. "There are 3 women in this county," he said slowly, "who have land they can't work, widowed mostly. One of them was asking me last week if what you did the drainage the horses, if it was something that could be done again, on different land, with different circumstances." He looked up. "I didn't know what to tell her. I thought maybe you could tell her yourself." Sarah was quiet for a long time, the kind of long time that has something working through it. "Who is she?" Sarah said. "Margaret Holt," he said. "Her husband died in '78. She's been holding 60 acres east of town that flood every spring. She's been told for 2 years it's worthless." Sarah looked at him. She thought about June of 1879 and what it would have meant then if someone had walked into the feed store and said, "I've done this before. I can show you how." What it would have meant to not have to figure it all out alone. "I'll come," she said. The harvest gathering was held in the field behind the community hall, the way it always was, with tables set out and food brought from every household and children running between wagons and horses tied in the shade. Sarah arrived with Daniel and Elias, who had cleaned up considerably and was wearing a jacket she'd never seen before and was deeply uncomfortable with the entire social situation, but had come anyway because she'd asked him. The change was in the quality of how people looked at her, not dramatically, not with ceremony. But she saw at the difference between being looked at as a curiosity, a strange story, a woman doing something no one understood, and being looked at as someone whose choices had turned out to mean something. People nodded when she passed. Mrs. Alderman touched her arm. Arlen Briggs introduced her to his brother-in-law from the next county with the specific words, "She's the one who opened the West Field," as if that were a title. Cecil Pruitt, who had watched her walk past with her horses in June of last year and said nothing useful, then came up to her now and said in front of several people, "I've been telling everyone what you did, the drainage system, the horses. I think people need to understand that this county has more land than it thinks it has." Sarah looked at him. "She thought you told people I was going to fail. She thought you stood at your window. She thought you're not the same person you were, and neither am I. And that's what a year does when you let it." "Thank you, Cecil," she said, and meant it mostly. Margaret Holt found her before noon. She was a woman about Sarah's age, dark-haired, with the hands of someone who had been working her own land without help, and the eyes of someone who had been doing it while being told it was pointless. She stood in front of Sarah and didn't waste time on preamble. "Ned Carver said you might talk to me about the East Land," she said. "I will," Sarah said. "It floods every spring. Everyone says it's low ground and I should give up on it." "Does it flood or does it stay wet after the flood?" Sarah said. Margaret Holt blinked. "What's the difference?" "A lot," Sarah said. "Flooding is water coming in. Staying wet is water not going out. Those are different problems with different solutions." Margaret looked at her with the specific intensity of a woman who has been told there is no solution and is hearing for the first time that the problem may have been misdiagnosed. "And if it's not going out, then we find out where it needs to go," Sarah said, "and we give it a direction." Margaret Holt's breath came out in a slow, careful exhale, the kind that carries something heavy out with it. "When could you look at it?" she said. "Next week," Sarah said. "Bring me whatever records your husband left, any notes, any sketches, any letters about the land. And tell me, do you have horses?" "2," Margaret said. Old ones. Good, Sarah said. Old ones are better. They know how to read ground. Margaret Holt looked at her with an expression that Sarah recognized because she had worn it herself once standing at the edge of the West Field with her father's journal in her pocket, and a deadline and 20 horses nobody wanted, and a town that had already decided how the story ended. It was the expression of a woman standing at the edge of something that might be possible, that she hasn't allowed herself to fully believe yet, because believing and being wrong is worse than not believing at all. Come next week, Sarah said more gently. We'll look at it together. After the gathering, Sarah drove her wagon home in the late August evening, Elias beside her, Daniel riding alongside. The sky was doing what Wyoming skies did at the end of summer, going orange and purple in a way that was too large for any single person to take in all at once. She didn't try. She just let it be large and drove her horses home. Elias was quiet. The way he was always quiet after social gatherings. Recovering, she had come to understand, not from exhaustion, but from the specific effort of being around that many people, when your natural state was a field and an iron rod and the sound of water moving through earth. Margaret Holt's land, he said finally. You think it's drainage? I think there's a good chance, Sarah said. You want me to walk it? If you're back, I'll walk it, he said. Not an argument, just a statement. She nodded. Next week, she said. He nodded. They drove in silence for a while, the horses finding the road home without needing to be directed because horses who have made a journey many times remember the way. You know what I keep thinking about, Elias said. What? Your father, he said. 22 years old in that West Field, laying tile in the hot summer, not knowing what would happen to it. Not knowing if it would matter. He was quiet for a moment. He couldn't have known it would matter like this, that it would be 60 years later, and still mattering. Sarah held the reins in both hands and looked at the road ahead. He knew it would matter to the land, she said. I think that was enough for him. Elias made the sound that meant he was thinking about whether that was right and had decided it probably was. The ranch came into view. The south pasture was visible 26 horses, now moving in the evening light toward the water trough in the unhurried way of animals who are not afraid of what comes next. Stillwater at the front. The gray horse with the crooked ankle somewhere in the middle of the group, his head low, his pace steady, walking on ground he trusted. Sarah pulled the wagon through the gate, and the horses heard her come and moved toward the fence the way they always did. The way they had done every evening for 15 months, attentive present waiting. She climbed down from the wagon and stood in the yard of Whitaker Ranch on a late August evening in 1881 year, and 2 months after she had walked into Carver's Feed and Seed and asked for 20 horses nobody wanted, and she looked at what was around her, the horses, the field, the land her father had loved, and she had nearly lost and fought back from the edge of the drainage running clean under 160 acres of dark bottomland, the receipt in her coat pocket, the journal in her other pocket, the beginning of something that was going to be larger than she had planned for, and she understood in the particular way that understanding arrives when you've been working too hard to let it in earlier. What her father had been trying to give her when he wrote those 3 lines. Not a solution, not a plan, not even a drainage system. Instructions for looking at a thing that seemed wrong and asking, not is it broken, but what does it need? Stillwater pushed her nose against Sarah's shoulder. A request for attention. An old horse's way of saying, I'm here. I've been here. I'll be here. Sarah put her hand on the mare's face. I know, she said. Me too. Me. She fed the horses. She went inside. She made supper. She opened the journal to the last page and read what she'd written on the morning after she cleared the banknote, the words still there in her own hand. In the last space below her father's west field opened. Water corrected. Horses settled. Land paid. She picked up the pencil. Below that line she wrote one more Margaret Holt Eastland. Next week, Elias will walk it. She closed the journal. The land had been waiting. The water had found its direction. The horses nobody wanted had become the animals everyone respected. And Sarah Whitaker, who had been given 90 days to fail and had used them instead to understand something her father had spent a lifetime trying to finish. She had not saved her ranch, despite what this county believed about her. She had saved it because of exactly who she was. A woman who read the ground right, listened to the animals, and knew that what people call worthless is most often just something they haven't learned to see yet.